thanks to his leadership as well as the partnership and sacrifices made by over 60 members of an international coalition, we are making serious progress in pushing back ISIL out of Iraqi territory. Thousands of strikes have not only taken ISIL fighters off the war theater, but their infrastructure has been deteriorated and decayed.
That, of course, President Obama in his meeting a few weeks back with Prime Minister al-Abadi of Iraq. Needless to say, the events of this past week raised some questions as to whether things are going as well in Iraq as the president had suggested when it comes to ISIS. Here to discuss this and other matters of foreign policy, Dr. Herbert London, president of the London Center for Policy Research, senior fellow of the Manhattan Institute, and author of The Transformational Decade. Herb, always a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be with you.
And
Thank you.
I get you 2 segments this time, which makes me very happy because we always run out of time. So let's talk about ISIS in Iraq. We heard the president in an interview with The Atlantic this week say that he doesn't think that we're losing to ISIS.
In fact, he makes the claim that there haven't been any tactical defeats. And yet, interestingly, Anbar province, the largest province in Iraq, has been lost to ISIL. And not only the province, but Ramadi. Now, if you think about this province, all of the weapons that move through this territory move through Anbar province. And when he talks about the sorties, we are now engaged in roughly 7 sorties a day. The ISIL people know exactly when our planes are taking off. They go into hiding places. Right. We've had no effective damage as a result of the bombing that has occurred in this area. So by and large, the policy has failed. We have a failed policy. The president refuses to admit that. He also talks about the coalition. Where are the coalition members? 60 nations? I defy you to find even 2 nations that are engaged in this struggle. We know Iraq and probably some form of Iranian help, although that's dubious, and the United States. But nothing is really happening on the ground.
All right, so I believe it or not, I would agree with you. It is a failed policy, and as you know, I'm somebody who tends to stand up for President Obama when I can and when I think it's appropriate. This strategy obviously has not worked. There's no value in suggesting otherwise. The question that we face now is, what do we do about it? Do we begin by increasing the sorties? Because you're right, it's only 7 or so a day, obviously not having the impact we would like. Do we begin by increasing what we're doing in the air? Do we attempt to push our allies in the region, the Saudis, the Jordanians, to put their troops into the field of play? Or do we just go for it and send over American troops?
Well, first of all, sending over American troops I think would be very difficult. Politically, that would be very difficult indeed. However, increasing the number of special forces.
Not
right. Well, I'm talking about politically.
Right.
Increasing the number of special forces from 3,047, what we have at the moment, to something on the order of 10,000 would make a difference. That's not a dramatic increase when you think about it, but it would help. Second thing that I would do is I would be on the phone with President Sisi of Egypt and say, look, why not pool the resources of the Sunni nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, perhaps Jordan and Kuwait, and simply say, look, let's put together a force of some kind that would serve as a counterweight to whatever ambitions the ISIL people have.
How long would that take, pragmatically speaking, to really have an impact with that?
1 day. I mean,
really?
Yeah, they're prepared to engage in it. Look, they have
Do they have good enough forces to do this?
They have F-16s. The Egyptian army is fighting a war in the Sinai. Right. They're battle hardened. They've got a tough army. They're prepared to engage in this kind of struggle. They realize that you need 1, a counterweight to Iran, and 2, a counterweight to ISIL. I think those nations are prepared to do something, but they're not going to do it unless there's American leadership. They want to know the Americans stand behind them. And interestingly, the tilt that the United States has engaged in to Iran has militated against creating this kind of defense condominium I'm making reference to.
Interesting. You know, I have to ask the question. That makes sense. And I have to tell you that I haven't heard anybody lay it out quite as well as you just did, which is nice to hear because I hear a lot of complaining, very little in the way of suggestions to fix it. Why do you imagine the administration hasn't gone the route that you just suggested?
Well, I think there are 2 reasons for it. 1, the president never recognized Sisi, largely because he thinks that Sisi was engaged in a military coup when Morsi fell. That's number 1. And number 2, I think there is the belief on the part of the United States that we should be engaged in thinking of Iran as the stabilizing influence in that part of the world.
That's kind of a strange thing, though.
Well, it's a strange thing, but not so strange when you consider that from Brzezinski to Gates, even to the Iraqi commission that met with Bush, all of them argued that Iran could be the stabilizing influence in that area. And keep in mind, they built an empire. They built in Damascus, they built it in Beirut, they built it in Baghdad and Sana'a. So they have an empire. So the United States is now thinking, well, Iran may be our boots on the ground, the surrogate for American forces. I think it's a mistake. I'd much prefer to see the Sunni nations
for all
ally
the
with the
obvious
United
reasons,
States.
I would suspect.
Exactly.
I want to hear more. Fortunately, we have Dr. London staying with us when we come back, so you're going to want to stay with us. There's a whole lot more coming today on Malzberg, so you're going to want to hang in there with us. Make sure you do. Dr. Herbert London, when we return, don't go anywhere. The Steve Malzberg program continues. Back on the Steve Malzberg Show. If you're just joining, I'm Rick Unger filling in for Steve today. And we're going to go with part 2 of our discussion with Dr. Herbert London, the president of the London Center for Policy Research, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and author of a book I highly recommend, The Transformational Decade. Dr. London, when we left off, we were discussing what's going on in Ramadi with ISIL, your proposals and suggestions for a better way to approach it. You said something that got my attention. You noted that you didn't think it was politically feasible to send American troops into that region. Now, let me first ask you, is that a political thing, or do you think, setting politics aside, American troops are required?
I think American troops would be required, but I think that what you have to look at is the political equation. I think it's very difficult after Iraq and Afghanistan to redeploy. In this sense, I almost agree with the president that it's very, very difficult to redeploy. However, a lot depends on the leadership that's provided by the presidency. I mean, Americans, I think, are basically isolationist in their sentiments. From Robert Taft in the 1950s to Rand Paul today, there is a sentiment for isolationism. But a lot of that is overcome by the leadership that's provided in the White House. When you have a president who said, look, let me explain the reasons why it is important for us to be there, and let me explain to the American people our interests in the area. Keep in mind that that's a critical feature of any kind of leadership position. Then I think the Americans turn. Americans can be, well, I shouldn't use the word manipulated, but could, I think,
they can understand.
They can come to an understanding.
Well, we're seeing
reasonable
polls,
people.
Actually. We're seeing in polls out this week that Americans are warming to the idea of American troops in that region.
That's right.
But you know, the point that I always think it's important to make, if you believe, and I'm saying if, I don't know where you stand on this, if you believe that maybe we erred in doing the Iraq War the first time, it's amazing how much it can cost you, because if you did something that you shouldn't have done, the taste that it leaves. Now, maybe we should be sending Americans in to fight this particular war. It's not the same war as the Iraq War. It may be in the same country, but it's not the same war.
Well, there are a lot of
and yet
people
we
who are
won't
creating
do
those
it.
parallels. One, they're not the same, and two, even in the case of the Iraq War, was not a question of the strategy, it was the tactics. The strategy was correct. Taking out Saddam Hussein was a wise thing to do in my judgment. But the manner in which it was done, trying to build a democracy out of Iraq, was patently absurd.
Right.
And Bremer clearly was not the man to do it. So I think that in many respects what you have to consider is both the strategy and the tactics. What would be the appropriate tactics for the United States if we were to go back into Iraq? And that isn't clear.
So let me switch gears on you. The president, in an interview with The Atlantic this week, pointed out that it's his name that's going to be on any agreement we might reach on nuclear arms with Iran. His point being that he believes hopefully he'll be alive in 20 years, and if they have a bomb, it's always going to be on him. Does this sway you in terms of understanding what the president's doing with Iran, and that maybe he's not being quite so naive as some believe he is being?
I think he is being extremely naive, and keep in mind, when the president says they will not have nuclear weapons, on my watch, those 3 words, on my watch, he's already indicated that after 10 years they'll have sufficient fissile material to build nuclear weapons. He's made that admission. So in fact, they're going to have nuclear weapons. It's not whether, but when.
But he doesn't seem to think so. He seems to think that...
But he has already made the admission that they'll have enough fissionable material
Right.
to build nuclear weapons. Well, what do you think they're going to do? Who knows what's going to happen in 10 years? Maybe there'll be a regime change. Maybe the world changes.
Right.
Maybe there's some sort of convulsion in the Middle East. But the fact is that the president has made it clear there will not be nuclear weapons on my watch.
So
that's all you know.
I understand. You're a solutions guy. So what do you do? It's probably fair to say that if there is no deal with Iran this time around, that we're probably going to lose the support of other countries when it comes to the sanctions.
That is correct.
It'll be us and only us.
That's correct.
Can the United States put sufficient sanctions on Iran all by itself to have an impact?
Absolutely not.
So
I mean,
what do you do then?
There's only one answer, and that is a military solution of some kind. But I know how you're going to respond. I'm not talking about troops. I'm not even talking about bombs. There are all kinds of options that exist when you talk about a military option. Everything from what I call the edge, where you see where the areas of vulnerability are, to naval blockade, which we've talked about before.
Right.
There are lots of options that are available. There is not a non-military solution to this problem. Sanctions will not work, obviously, because you cannot recreate the sanctions regimen. Right. You're absolutely correct about that. And we certainly can't do it by ourselves. So I think when you think about this, there really aren't too many other answers.
Why are we not hearing what you just said from Republicans out there who are complaining about...
I can't speak for others in the Republican Party. I can't speak for any of the Republicans. I think by and large the Republicans have to think through what is an appropriate strategy for the future, what is the alternative to the Obama plan, and I think you're correct. We haven't heard enough of this. It's important for Republicans to do that.
Herb, always a pleasure having you. I really do. I enjoy talking to you because you come with solutions, not just complaints.
Well, thank you.
I hope you guys have a wonderful holiday weekend. Now, coming up next, Steve Malzberg pays a special tribute to the military in honor of Memorial Day and those who gave their lives in service to the country. We'll want you to stay tuned. I saw him do this. You're going to love it. Memorial Day, as you haven't seen it before, from Bryant Park, right outside the Newsmax studios.